Nothing is more thrilling than seeing a big steam locomotive thunder down the tracks with a heavy train in tow. The age of steam has long passed, but a few of these behemoths are still in working order and run a few times a year for all to enjoy. In this video, we'll see 3 famous big steam stars heading up excursions across the eastern United States, running in the states of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Michigan. With lovely scenery and seasoned crews at the helm of these operations, the resulting coverage was stunning. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our presentation of Big Steam Trio. Our first stop is at Pleasant Lake, Indiana, along the Indiana Northeastern Railroad. This short line operates on 130 miles of trackage formerly owned by the New York Central and Wabash Railroads, serving various agricultural and industrial customers in southern Michigan, northeastern Indiana, and northwestern Ohio. The Indiana Northeastern, or IN, has hosted a number of excursion trains along their system for many years. Partnering with the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, the IN is hosting the Indiana Rail Experience's Fall Color Train, which will be pulled by former Nickel Plate Road 284, number 765. 765 was built in September of 1944 by the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. She was one of 80 such Berkshires built for general service on the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, more famously known as the Nickel Plate Road. Part of Lima's superpower lineup, these impressive locomotives stood nearly 16 feet tall, were equipped with 69-inch drivers, operated at a boiler pressure of 245 psi, were capable of producing 64,135 pounds of tractive effort, and they could reach a top speed of 75 miles per hour. The Berkshires were capable of both passenger and freight service, but were primarily the preferred power for fast manifest freight trains during World War II and into the 1950s, running over the railroad's lengthy trackage between Buffalo, New York, and Chicago, Illinois. The Nickel Plate completely dieselized by 1960, and the Berkshires were retired, with most of them being scrapped. Luckily, 6 were preserved. 765 was donated to the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, and remained on display in Lawton Park from 1964 until 1972, when she was leased, and later sold, to the newly formed Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society for restoration to working order. The locomotive was rebuilt without the aid of an overhead roof, and was the first steam engine in America to be restored by an all-volunteer, non-profit organization. She made her first run in preservation in 1979. 765 has been a popular excursion locomotive since her restoration, running on numerous mainline and shortline trips across the country east of the Mississippi River. The date is October 20th, 2024, and 765 will be heading up the Fall Color Train along the former New York Central Railroad line from Pleasant Lake, Indiana to Hillsdale, Michigan, a distance of about 33.5 miles. Despite this being a shorter journey, 765 has her support cars in tow between her and the coaches. The auxiliary tender, numbered 767, was originally a coal and water tender from Louisville and Nashville Railroad 284, number 1970. When the L&N dieselized and the locos were scrapped, the railroad retained dozens of these tenders and used them in maintenance-of-way service. Several have found use as auxiliary tenders for mainline steam locomotives, and this one has been with the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society since 1984. The tool car was built in 1952 by the St. Louis Car Company for the U.S. Army. It was built as a hospital kitchen car, but ultimately never saw service for the Army and was retired after 20 years of storage. It was purchased by the Fort Wayne Group in 1980 for use as 765's tool car and has remained with them ever since. At 9:30, 765's Mars light bounces into life. Her bell starts ringing and she toots her whistle twice as she eases the 12-car train out of Pleasant Lake, bound for Hillsdale, Michigan. A nice mix of passenger cars make up the train, including the 1923-built former Nickel Plate Road Pullman car Kichi-Gami Club, a combination diner-sleeper observation car. Though privately owned at the time of this excursion, it was acquired by the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society in 2025. Other standouts on this train include the two open cars, which previously served as elephant cars on the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus train. They, too, are owned by the FWRHS, as are these former Pennsylvania Railroad in-class sleepers, built by the Budd Company in Philadelphia in 1949. They were reconfigured to coaches in the 1960s. Two former Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe lightweight baggage cars are also on the train. The Fort Wayne Group has reconfigured them for their needs, turning one into an open-air gift shop car and fitting the other with an HEP generator to power the train's lights and climate control. The rest of the train is made up mostly of privately owned cars that have been leased for these excursions, including the recently restored Roanoke, a 1917-built former Norfolk and Western Railway business car. .765 is running with an impure load of water, which can turn into foam in the boiler, resulting in suboptimal performance. The presence of foam is made known by a somewhat muted whistle. Despite the persistence of the foaming, 765's fireman manages to keep it in check throughout the day, and the train soldiers on. A slow order is in place through Fremont, Indiana. 765 takes her time as she crosses over Toledo Street, but picks up speed as she clears the crossing. Our train has crossed into Michigan and is passing through the little old town of Montgomery. The old New York Central Depot sits adjacent to the track and is planned to be restored in the coming years. At Reading, the train passes the huge grain elevators where farmers offload their goods to be shipped by rail. The train has arrived at its destination in Hillsdale, Michigan. 765 eases the train to the crossing on Hillsdale Street, coming to a halt as her pilot settles above the concrete. The excursion has a 3-hour layover, and passengers disembark to explore the town. We next catch the train around a curve adjacent to Lake Wilson Road. We're at the border of Michigan and Indiana, in the small village of Ray. This area is home to a small Mennonite population, as demonstrated by the horse and cart crossing over the tracks. The train will stop here, let off passengers, and back up for a series of photo run-bys. Following the photo run-bys, we catch the train passing a pond along Ray Road, just north of Fremont, Indiana. At Angola, we see the train easing its way through town, accelerating past the Depot Grill, located on the campus of Trine University. .765 has returned to Pleasant Lake ahead of schedule and passes by fellow nickel plate alumni, diesel locomotive number 358, as she brings the train to a stop. Once the passengers have disembarked, 765 and her support cars are uncoupled, and 358 is moved into position to couple up to the train for the deadhead to Hillsdale to turn it around. 358 was built by General Motors Electromotive Division in 1957 for the Nickel Plate Road. It was used primarily on freight trains, and went on to be used as such by the Norfolk and Western Railway after its merger with the Nickel Plate, and worked as a switcher for N&W successor Norfolk Southern until 2010. Whilst in the middle of being scrapped, the diesel was saved by the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, and they gradually restored it to its as-built condition, debuting in 2023. It accompanies 765 on ferry moves and helps with switching around passenger equipment. At nightfall, 358 tows the empty coaching stock back to Hillsdale to be turned around on the Y junction, before returning with it in the darkness of the autumn night. The coaching stock will remain on the Indiana Northeastern for future Indiana Rail Experience excursions during the fall and Christmas time. Meanwhile, Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society volunteers perform maintenance on 765 after the 67-mile round trip. The locomotive and support cars will be ferried over the Norfolk Southern back home to the FWRHS's site in New Haven, Indiana, the following day. 765 is a classic steamer. She is a must-see for any rail fan, so be sure to look out for any of the Fort Wayne Group's future events so you have a chance to see and ride behind this venerable locomotive. Moving on, we travel deep into the heart of the Allegheny Mountains along the Buckingham Branch Railroad line. Originally part of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad's main line, this trackage is presently owned by the state of Virginia and sees a variety of trains every day. CSX has trackage rights over this line for freight, as does the smaller-scale Buckingham Branch Railroad. Additionally, Amtrak's Cardinal service traverses this line on its journey from New York City to Chicago via West Virginia. More recently, a new excursion operation, known as the Virginia Scenic Railway, has started hauling tourists between Goshen and Staunton, Virginia. The date is October 14, 2023, and the Virginia Scenic is hosting a rather illustrious locomotive, former Norfolk and Western Railway 484 number 611. Built in 1950 at the N&W's shops in Roanoke, this classic streamlined steam locomotive has been a famous excursion star for decades, but in recent years has been relegated to tourist lines and museum tracks. However, for the month of October 2023, 611 has been invited by the Virginia Scenic Railway to run a series of excursions called the Shenandoah Valley Limited, running between Goshen and Staunton on select weekends. We'll go trackside to see this beautiful locomotive in action along the old C&O. We first see the train backing out of the boarding area in Goshen, where we get a look at the diverse mix of passenger cars behind the engine. 2 are from the Virginia Scenic Railway, 3 from the VMT, some are chartered from various private owners, and a few are from chapters of the National Railway Historical Society, or NRHS for short. Of note is former N&W coach car number 537, which was one of over a dozen similar coaches used on the Powhatan Arrow train between Norfolk, Virginia and Cincinnati, Ohio, and was in fact pulled by the J-class locomotives in regular service in the 1950s. The car is maintained by the Roanoke chapter of the NRHS. Positioned directly behind the 611's tender are her auxiliary tender and tool car. The tool car is a former Canadian National Railway baggage car built in 1955. The CN used it on their passenger services to carry luggage and mail up until the 1980s, when it was put into excursion service on the Norfolk Southern Railway steam program as a tool car. The auxiliary tender, like 765's, is a former L&N Big Emma tender, converted into a pollution control car used in work train services. Since the 1980s, it has been used as an extra water tender for a number of steam locomotives in excursion service, most famously behind 611. Like 611, both support cars are maintained by the Virginia Museum of Transportation. A pair of 1970s-era diesel locomotives from the Buckingham Branch Railroad are seen heading for Staunton ahead of our train. These diesels will be pulling the train back to Goshen later in the day, as there is no place to turn the train around in Staunton. Now on the main, 611 has the right-of-way and starts her trek towards Staunton, and rounds the bend out of the Goshen yard. .611 was one of 14 Class J 484 locomotives built between 1941 and 1950 for the N&W's high-speed passenger trains between Norfolk and Cincinnati. The locomotives operated at a boiler pressure of 300 psi, sat on 70-inch drivers, and could produce 80,000 pounds of tractive effort, making them some of the most powerful passenger locomotives in the world. They were capable of attaining speeds of 110 miles per hour. 611 is the sole survivor of the class, being saved from scrap in 1960 and donated to the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke, Virginia. In the 1970s, the locomotive was a candidate for pulling the American Freedom Train, a transcontinental railroad tour of the United States in celebration of the country's bicentennial. The engine was even illustrated in conceptual art for the train, minus her bullet nose and skyline casing. But she was ultimately not chosen and remained on display in Roanoke for the next few years. As fate would have it, however, 611 went on to become a famous excursion locomotive in the 1980s. She operated on many excursions for the Norfolk Southern Railway's steam program between 1982 and 1994 throughout the southeastern, northeastern, and midwestern regions of the United States. When the program was canceled, the locomotive was put back on display at the Virginia Museum of Transportation. After a further 20 years on display, 611 was taken to the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina in 2014 for another full mechanical restoration. The work was complete in May of 2015, and the engine became part of Norfolk Southern's 21st Century Steam program. She ran a number of trips over the NS for the next 2 years. NS ceased running mainline excursions in 2017 as insurance costs rose, and 611 primarily operated at the NCTM in Spencer and the Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania. The Shenandoah Valley Limited trips are 611's first high-speed excursions in over half a decade, and we are very thankful for the opportunity to see this magnificent locomotive doing what it was built to do, pulling fast, heavy passenger trains in the mountainous regions of Virginia. The train is on a slight downhill grade as it drifts swiftly through Craigsville, a little old town along Route 42. Beyond this town, the grade will start climbing once again to North Mountain, averaging about 1.2% for most of the run up. The summit of North Mountain stands at about 2,082 feet above sea level, ascending from 1,529 feet in Craigsville. Just before the summit, the line climbs a steep 3% grade, which is steeper than most grades you'll find on a mainline railroad. We hear 611 has slowed down to a crawl, and with some slipping, she pops into view and just barely crests the grade at the North Mountain Junction. The Shenandoah Valley Limited has arrived at Staunton. 611 salutes the city with a toot of her whistle and brings the train slowly to a halt. Passengers remain on board as the diesels from earlier pull in from a siding to couple onto the rear of the train. As stated near the beginning of this segment, there is no way to turn 611 or her train around at either end of the line, so the westbound leg will be pulled by the Buckingham Branch Railroad's GP40 locomotives 7 and 13. The train rounds the bend into Goshen, passing the old C&O freight depot. .611 has switched onto the branch line leading to the boarding area, and will pull the train forwards the rest of the way before coming to a stop. A CSX freight can be heard blowing for a crossing in the distance. Old meets new as the CSX freight, an empty grain train, rumbles by on the main line, heading towards Clifton Forge, Virginia. .611 rounds the final bend into the boarding area in Goshen, closing our visit to the Shenandoah Valley. 611 is scheduled to return to this line in late 2025, and we look forward to the chance to see her running in a mainline setting once again. The Virginia Scenic Railway offers a number of diesel-hauled excursions throughout the year, and even without the J as power, we highly recommend a trip along this lovely trackage. As for future excursions with other steam locomotives on this line, well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens in the coming years. For our final stop, we travel to the borough of Nesquehoning, Pennsylvania, along the Reading and Northern Railroad. A familiar sight for us, this Class II freight railroad is quite famous for its steam excursions, of which they run several every year. Nesquehoning is located in Carbon County, just south of the Lehigh Valley region, and is the site of a new station along the Reading and Northern. The railroad is introducing excursions out of this borough, today's being an 11-hour round trip to Pittston, Pennsylvania, and return. The power for this excursion is number 2102, a former Reading Company Class T1 484. Constructed in 1945, using the boiler from a 1923-built Baldwin 280, 2102 was one of 30 T1s used on heavy freight trains. The T1s were beasts, sporting 70-inch drivers, operating at a boiler pressure of 240 psi, boasting a firebox with a great area of 94.5 square feet, and were capable of producing 68,000 pounds of tractive effort. With the booster fitted on the trailing truck, an additional 11,100 pounds of tractive effort was gained. 2102 operated all around the Reading Company's system in freight and pusher service until her retirement in 1956. After serving as a stationary boiler for a few years, the engine was reactivated by the Reading for use on their excursions called the Iron Horse Rambles. Between 1962 and 1964, 2102 and sister 2100 ran dozens of these trips all over the Reading Company's system. The trips concluded in 1964, and 2102 was sold to Steam Tours Incorporated, a company that ran her on excursions all over the eastern and midwestern United States between 1966 and 1985. The locomotive was sold to the Reading and Northern Railroad in 1986 and pulled various excursions on and off the system until she was retired in 1991. After a number of years in storage, 2102 was restored to operational condition between 2016 and 2022, and still pulls several excursions a year on various parts of the Reading and Northern system. We'll follow 2102 between Nesquehoning and Pittston, Pennsylvania. We first see 2102 and train at Nesquehoning Junction, where she travels on to the old branch of the Lehigh Division towards Mountaintop, Pennsylvania, and beyond. The train is seen snaking its way through the Lehigh Gorge at Glen Onoko, crossing a girder bridge over the Lehigh River and moving through a rock cut. This trackage is also used by the R&N-managed Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railroad, which runs excursions between Jim Thorpe and Penn Haven Junction during the summer and fall, though 2102 will continue north through the junction on her way to Pittston. We next see the train crossing over Tannery Road, just south of the town of Whitehaven. A diesel-hauled Pittston to Jim Thorpe excursion is waiting on the far track for the Ramble to pass. Six former Reading Company arch roof coaches, once used as EMU trailers, head up the train behind the engine and power car. They were built in the early 1930s and are equipped with special trucks for use on high-speed trains in and out of the Philadelphia area. The Reading cars are followed by a single, freshly repainted Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad EMU trailer coach. Mountaintop, also known as Penobscot on the railroad map, is a scheduled water stop for this excursion, so 2102 brings the train to a halt beyond the crossing. New additions to the train for the 2024 season come in the form of a number of lightweight coaches. One of these is the Pocono Grill, a dining car originally built as a club lounge by the Budd Company in 1950 for the Southern Pacific. Following Pocono Grill are 3 Budd 84-seat coaches built as in-series sleepers by Budd for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1949, named Pinnacle, Solomon's Gap, and Drake's Creek. The newest addition is Schuylkill River, a 646 sleeper car built by Pullman Standard in 1954 for the Boston and Maine Railroad. As usual, premium cars bring up the rear of the train, this time in the form of Pullman Sleeper Hickory Run, Parlor Car Number 3, and the Glen Onoko Falls Observation. The last 3 cars on the train are private cars for the CEO of the railroad, Andy Muller Jr., who is on board the train with friends and family. Just beyond Penobscot lies a 2% grade down into Pittston, which is one of the steepest grades on the railroad. Diesel helpers have been added to the train for dynamic braking down the steep grade towards Pittston, which will save the brakes on 2102 and the coaches from wear. Arriving at Pittston, the Iron Horse Ramble makes an entrance with a chorus of whistles and horns as it pulls into the modern Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Regional Station. This August excursion coincided with Pittston's annual Tomato Festival, and several buses were chartered to take riders to and from the downtown area, where the festivities took place. In the meantime, the diesel helpers are uncoupled from the train. Then, 2102 pulls the train out of the station and pushes it back towards the northwestern end of the Y junction around the station. The train is now on the southern end of the Y and pulls through to set out the 3 private cars on a siding inside the Y. After setting the cars out, the train traverses the final leg of the Y past an old wigwag crossing. Later, the train pulls back into the station where passengers will reboard. We'll follow the train on its way back to Nesquehoning, a run that will require 2102 to tackle the 2% grade up to mountaintop. The train pulls into the yard at Penobscot, cresting the grade. 2102 will take on water from a tank car at the south end of the yard before resuming her journey. The train crosses over the Lehigh River, coming to a stop at a red signal near the junction. Once the line is clear, 2102 eases the train forwards and throttles her way to Nesquehoning. The Reading and Northern is one of the last bastions of mainline steam excursions on the East Coast. And if you ever get a chance to see or ride behind 2102 on one of these excursions, take it. You won't be disappointed. Nothing turns heads like a big steam locomotive, and we're thankful to have been able to see 3 amazing examples of such, each running in a different region of the country. If you ever get a chance to see a big steamer running anywhere, you won't regret taking it. We hope you've enjoyed Big Steam Trio. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the AceofTrains YouTube channel, and follow us on our other social media listed in the description.